Just get ready for a wild ride. That's all I'll say.
Okay.
Not only do I believe that minor marriage was acceptable in the past, I also believe that it's an institution that society abandons at its own peril.
Could a man have a marriage to a 5-year-old consummated if she started precocious puberty?
If she starts showing signs of physical maturity, then yes, that's permissible, as I stated.
Chris Hansen would like for you to take a seat. Take a seat right over there as we dive in.
Okay, thanks for joining us today, everybody. Today I have with me Michael Jones. Mike Jones, you might be asking, who is Mike Jones? The answer to that is not the legend of Houston hip-hop, but the legend of YouTube Christian apologetics. Michael, would you mind briefly introducing yourself to the audience for those who might not be familiar with your work?
Yeah, my name is Michael Jones. I just got my master's in philosophy last year from the University of Arizona. I do Christian apologetics, and my YouTube channel is Inspiring Philosophy.
Awesome. So, Mike Jones just recently had a debate with Daniel Haqiqatjou on Matter Day Debate at DebateCon 2, I believe, right? With on the subject of, is child marriage ethical? Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, his idea. He wanted to challenge me on that debate. And it's been a dumpster fire for him since. It did not make him look well.
I saw in Pints with Aquinas, you said, just get ready for a wild ride. That's all I'll say. And that was an understatement, it seemed like, wasn't it?
That's because I had been preparing for it for months. I knew how he was probably going to argue, and he did not disappoint me at all.
Yeah, I was kind of blown away with the amount of papers and books that you cited in your, not only in your opening presentation, but in your rebuttal and in the cross-examination. You said you prepared for months. I mean, I saw that you're referencing all sorts of other debates and discussions that you'd had with other people you found online. I'm curious, how many hours of preparation did you spend in this for this debate?
Well, a lot. I can talk about that a little bit. When he challenged me, it kind of like, I'd say struck a nerve, because I have a daughter, and it's like, who's still like under 10. So it's like, this guy really wants to argue for child marriage. No, it's on. I'm going to make him regret it. Even though he'll never admit it, I'm going to give him a living hell over this. This is pure evil. So the moment I saw his post, I dropped whatever I was doing, and I read like studies on child marriage for like 3 hours. And then I waited for him to eventually privately challenge me, and he never did. So he just made this big public proclamation, like chest beating, and then didn't do anything, which made me think he didn't really want to have the debate. He was just, hyping his audience up. So I contacted Modern Day Debate, and I said, set this up. It's happening. He's not getting out of this. And then I also thought, I'm in a difficult situation. Well, I'm in an interesting situation here. It's like, typically when I debate people, they either don't prepare well, or they just watch the videos they already have on the topic. I knew Daniel was going to prepare, but I don't have any videos on the topic. So I said, I'll upload some videos eventually. And sure enough, by luck, I guess, or divine providence, some Muslim on TikTok started challenging me on Aisha and child marriage stuff. And I'm like, this is the perfect opportunity where I'm going to upload some videos where I'm just not going to use the best arguments I have saved. I'm just going to use some moderate, okay arguments. I think it will get the job done. But I know Daniel will know how to respond to these, in hopes that it will misdirect him. And I'm not sure if it worked. I'm not sure he even did a lot of research on me, but that was the goal of those. And then when I got into the debate, I had basically researched him for hours, watching his debates, trying to figure out how he thinks, reading up on the topic, reading all sorts of studies, reading papers he cited. Like I read the guy he cites often, Bruce Rind. Read a couple of his papers, and was just mortified at the stuff he was arguing, because Bruce Rind's an outlier. And so, yeah, I had basically, by the time we got to the debate, I had read so much on that. There was just so much research to go over. I have arguments prepared for him that he hasn't even made yet. Like, I have objections to arguments he could make, and he hasn't even made them yet. That's how much I prepared for this debate.
I mean, is there anything that you would want to get out right now, or you kind of want to save it just in case he brings it up?
Well, I want to save it, but let's recently on Twitter, he's been going on this tirade where he's on the whole Bruce Rind meta-analysis thing. So in the debate, he didn't cite it in his opening statement. He just said, Bruce Rind and Tromovich and the Bozerman have published meta-studies in arguing that, child sexual abuse is not inherently harmful. Now, when I heard that in the debate, I was like, okay, those three guys published a meta-analysis in 1998. Okay. He didn't cite it. He just said studies, plural. So I was like, okay, well, if he's referring to their meta-analysis he's citing, that would be the dumbest thing he could ever do. Because one, it's an outlier. There are numerous other meta-analyses that show they're wrong. Two, the study's been heavily criticized by numerous authors for methodological issues. And three, it doesn't even support Daniel's notion. What they try to do in this meta-analysis is they take self-reported sample sizes of college students, and they basically come to the conclusion that men who were abused as children did not report negative experiences, but the women did. So he wants to argue for child marriage with girls, and all the girls in this paper are basically saying, the overwhelming amount are saying, yes, this was harmful. This was a horrible experience for me. So is Daniel... I gave him too much credit, I guess you could say. I'm like, surely he can't be citing that one because of all the problems with it, and how it doesn't even support his conclusion. But then later, in the open discussion, he said that's what he was citing. So I pointed out he didn't understand what it actually said, and then he tried to read from the abstract. Well, lately on Twitter, he's been claiming that I misrepresented him or I didn't understand because I was just so incompetent. I'm like, okay, you never cited their paper. You cited... just their studies in general, didn't actually refer to it. And I was giving you too much credit in the debate, Daniel. I thought you couldn't be that bad as to cite a meta-analysis that doesn't even agree with your conclusion. So he's been trying to do damage control ever since his poor debate performance. And this is just one example. The study he cited, the 1998 meta-analysis, does not show that child sexual abuse was not harmful to women. It showed that in their self-reported measures, they did report harm. And again, this meta-analysis is still an outlier. The overwhelming majority of research that has been conducted in umbrella studies shows that it is harmful to boys and girls. So cherry picking research there. So I had read so much for the debate. I knew what he could have brought up, was ready to cite it, ready to go over it. I just wasn't expecting him to be so bad as to cite papers that just went directly against him. And again, this is what he kind of did. He said it vaguely, tried to refer to authors and studies they published without ever being clear. Because quite honestly, I don't think he did a lot of good research on this.
So could you give us an impression of just how much of an outlier this Bruce Rind study is? I mean, I know, like you said before, it's not even like, it doesn't support the conclusion that he was trying to present, but even like within the literature, how much of an outlier is it?
Oh, very much an outlier. So there was a study done in 2019 in the Lancet, and it's an umbrella study. So just so people understand research here. So typically studies are done, and they study different effects like for child sexual abuse. So studies are done. Then researchers will compile systematic reviews or meta-analyses of all of these studies. And so they'll go, okay, what is what are these 40 or what are these 50 studies saying? And that's the meta-analysis. Then you get umbrella studies, and umbrella studies compile all the meta-analyses to find out what the overall trend is. So in 2019, there was long-term outcomes of child sexual abuse, an umbrella review, and they looked at 19 meta-analysis, which included 559 primary studies covering 28 outcomes in over 4 million participants. And they found that child sexual abuse was in the majority of the meta-analyses, like the overwhelming majority, it was continually associated with negative psychological and mental health outcomes, poor physical health, all of these things. So you got like 19 meta-analyses, and you got like maybe one like Rind study from 1998 saying that, no, it's not harmful to the boys, even though it's harmful to the girls. I mean, but the rest of the meta-analyses, or at least most of them, are saying, no, it actually is harmful to children in general. So when you look at the umbrella study that was conducted, you can see the overwhelming amount of research shows that Rind is clearly an outlier. I mean, this is just what the data shows. And so what Haqiqatjou is doing is he's just cherry picking. He's either not aware or he's cherry picking that numerous studies shows that Rind is wrong. And again, Rind's meta-analysis has been criticized ever since. Check out Anna Sattler's book, Predators. She's got a whole section, I believe it's somewhere between page 60 and 70, where she addresses a lot of Rind's research and shows that it's an outlier. There's a lot of bias that went into his research. So yeah, it's not a good place to go to. And I didn't think Daniel would be that bad as to use that as his study to go to.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting that he would do that in light of the fact that he was saying that, well, we can't ever find a study from a Western university because of the taboos surrounding it. But then he's also trying to present studies that support it from Western universities. So it
Oh
seems like
yeah,
there's a little bit of contradiction there in some part.
oh, he's full of contradictions. I mean, like, I could cite you one now that's an outlier. So this one called Child Marriage and Associated Outcomes in Northern Ghana, cross-sectional study. Child marriage is common in North Ghana and is associated with poor health, increased child mortality, low agency among women. But they also report that it was that women who were in their 20s and were married as children did report high levels of self-esteem. So there's an outlier metric right there. But they even note in their own study that that measure they found is an outlier when you compare it to all sorts of other research showing lower self-esteem among child brides. So you can find outliers. Rind, for example, this Richard de Groot's paper here that I just mentioned, you can find that kind of stuff. What does the overall research show? Well, it overwhelmingly shows child marriage is harmful. And even researchers that find outlier metrics will report child marriage is still harmful and should be, we need to find ways to end this.
At one point, he was mentioning how some of these studies that report the harm of the victims of childhood abuse, that the abuse is mostly linked to the family environment rather than the sexual act itself. Could you shed some light on that response right there?
Yeah, just real quick, I misspoke on the de Groot study. I said self-esteem, I meant stress. It reported lower levels of stress, and again, that was an outlier metric. Typically, studies find higher levels of stress among child brides. So yeah, what Rind is basically doing in his papers, he's saying that when these boys have been abused, it may be more circumstantial data, not necessarily related to the abuse. That's what he's trying to argue. And, most researchers are just not convinced by what he said. Again, as I've noted numerous times, this guy is an outlier. For this guy to be your go-to, study, it's, you really got to look at the umbrella study from 2019 to get a far better understanding of what's going on. So Anna Sattler in Predators, for example, notes that, you got to think of this. You got to think of this she compares it to being bit by a rattlesnake. She says, here's what she says. She says on page 63 of her book, at the end of several months of research, however, I was convinced of one thing. Child sexual abuse was like getting bitten by a rattlesnake. Some kids recovered completely and some didn't, but it wasn't good for anybody. So what Rind had tried to do is he says, well, the sexual abuse may not have been harmful, according to the self-reported measures of these college students we found. For these boys, it may not have been as harmful. It could have just resulted from cultural stigma, family issues, that kind of stuff. Well, no. I mean, most of the research, as Sattler points out, it's like being bit by a rattlesnake. Some kids, it takes a while to recover. Some recover quickly. A lot of the boys in Rind's paper recovered quickly, obviously. So, sure, that happens at times, but there's no reason to think it has not been harmful at some point. The other thing to keep in mind is what Rind did is he only focused in on college samples. Now, that's an important distinction that his critics have pointed out. A lot of the people that have serious problems that result from child sexual abuse don't end up going to college because they've been so emotionally and mentally scarred. They just can't handle it. So basically, you just go to the kids that have recovered quickly and go, yep, they're fine right now. Yeah, but you're excluding all the kids that couldn't get to college because they were so harmed by this. Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of these kids have been groomed to think it was okay. Anna Sattler talks about this in her book, that a lot of the children are groomed to think that child sexual abuse is normal, it was fine, even though we know it causes mental damage and it causes physical damage at times. She cites numerous examples and studies that show this. So again, Ryan is sort of like playing fast and loose with his data. He's defining harm in a weird way. He defines harm in the sense that it doesn't cause long-term psychological issues among, again, just the college sample sizes. Let's not talk about the kids that didn't get to go to college because of all the harm that resulted.
Right.
But again, as critics have said, well, harm doesn't have to be necessarily defined so strictly. A kid could be abused and then he goes through 3 years of therapy and then he gets better. That's great. Mm-hmm. But he still had to go through all that therapy to get over the harm that it caused to him. So you can have harm from child sexual abuse that did not cause, lifelong harm, but it still is harm.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. It was interesting because he kept, he kept bringing up this false dichotomy that either you support child marriage or you support transgender children. You know what I mean? It's just like that's not exactly a completely fair representation, but really that black and white false dichotomous thinking kind of was just like replete throughout all of the debate from his side, obviously. But it really is like, it seems to me like an illustration of the horseshoe model of political dimensions or whatever it is, where like the extremes meet on certain things. Like he was saying, okay, well, we can't have drag story hour for kids, so that's bad, but we're still going to sexualize them, we're just going to marry them instead.
Yeah.
Like, I mean,
it's funny how they I was going to say, yeah, it's funny how they both want to sexualize children in just different ways. It's kind of creepy. Well, he's wrong for one thing. He said that, all the research confirms right now that, transitioning children is great. No, again, there's a great article called Gender Dysphoria is Rising and So is Professional Disagreement on bmj.com. And it cites several researchers that are concerned about this because, again, it's been understudied. We haven't had a lot of time to really look into this. It's relatively new. Child marriage has been around for a long time and it's been studied for decades. And all the researchers are in agreement that it's harmful. So his comparison doesn't work. But that just shows you how poor he is when it comes to research. And so, yeah, he tried that. And again, he always goes to these extremes. Either you come with me and support this horrible practice called child marriage that's going to lead to so much harm for young girls and boys, or you support every other extreme thing that I reject. You can't live in these ridiculous false dichotomies, but that's how he always debates. I've seen him do it numerous times.
Oh, really? That's a pattern with him.
Oh God, is it ever a pattern with him? Yeah, it's either he does this thing where it's like either you accept all of his conservative Islam BS, or you're going to go on a slippery slope, which is another fallacy, into the other extreme, which is just not true. And I brought up Bruce Rind in the debate on purpose because Bruce Rind shows that throughout Islamic societies in the past, they were practicing man-boy love and man-boy erotic poetry for centuries. For centuries. Islam couldn't curb that. It only ended when Western influence came in and ended it all. So maybe if we go back into the Islamic extreme, we'll get back to that kind of practice. So, but he won't say that. No, that doesn't come from Islam. Fine. But then don't say that all of this other extreme craziness comes from Christianity or from liberalism. That's just not true. So anything he doesn't like, it leads to the extremes, but his view won't lead to the extremes. You can't do that. So he's committing something called a attribution error, and this is in psychology. So you attribute to your enemies all of the you attribute the harm all your enemies cause to their ideology, but your own ideology doesn't cause harm. It just comes from circumstantial issues. So he's committing an attribution error. Depending on how he makes his argument, he's committing fallacy one way or another. If it's not false dichotomy or a slippery slope fallacy or an attribution error, depends on how he words these. He's always somehow bordering or directly committing a fallacy.
Right, that makes sense. I mean, the quality of his research being questionable was illustrated on quite a number of points during the debate. One of which, obviously, when he was just kind of debating by means of a single abstract, right, in that Rind meta-analysis. I was like, well, I can read the abstract. You're like, dude, we can read the paper. He's like, well, no, this'll do. Which, I mean, fair enough. Sometimes that might be the case, but in this case, it certainly wasn't, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, Rind is kind of notorious for having misleading abstracts. I've noticed in my own. But if I just read from the 1990 meta-analysis, he says towards the end, I think it's like on the second to last page or so, says, in general, findings from the current review suggest that socio-legal definitions of child sexual abuse have more scientific validity in the case of female children in adolescence than for male children in adolescence, given the higher rate of unwanted negative experiences for women. So again, that's not in the abstract, but if you read the study, he makes this distinction later on that the boys in his survey, again, still an outlier, but in his survey reported that the boys had finding their experiences were not that harmful, but the girls were reporting negative experiences. So he needs to read beyond the abstract. You cannot get all the data from an abstract. That's just fallacious. Sometimes you can get a general idea, but often I've read studies and I'm like, and then I go back and look at the abstract and I'm like, the abstract either overstated its case or understated its case. You have to check those things.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's That's very thorough. I mean, that's one reason why I've been watching, like I mentioned before we got started, I've been watching your content for a long time. You kind of like up level. I don't want to, sing praises or anything too much or, overly congratulate you, but I do appreciate the amount of research that you put into all of your content, and that you have scholars check your videos before you even publish them to fact check and make sure that all the I's are dotted, and all the T's are crossed. It's very laudable. Now, thank you. And one thing that I wanted to bring up was that, which connects to this part about him not being fully thorough in his research, is that the point where he talks about Rebecca and Mary, the marriage of Rebecca with Isaac in Genesis, and then Mary with Joseph, where he says that Rebecca was 3, and that according to the Catholic Encyclopedia, that there are Christians, early traditions that said that Mary was 12, either when she was married to Jesus. I mean, when she was married, not to Jesus, excuse me, married to Joseph, and then also impregnated or gave birth to Jesus. So could you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, let's. So, if we cited this Catholic Encyclopedia on the age of Joseph and Mary, but I mean, that's ridiculous. The Catholic Encyclopedia, on its entry on Joseph, says that these ages are from apocryphal works. They're unreliable. We can't necessarily rely on them. Luckily, he didn't say the Bible says that Rebecca was 3. He says that the Talmud says that she was 3. Now, yeah, there are Talmudic passages. The problem I see with a lot of Muslims when they look at the Talmud is they treat it like it's like Islamic legal texts, like everything in it is law, and that's just nonsense. Jews don't even treat it that way. A lot of what's going on in the Talmud is different conversations between different rabbis about how to interpret different passages. Some parts don't even come to, direct conclusions on things. So, some Talmudic passages talk about the age of Rebecca being 14. Some say 3. Okay. These are not legal texts. And so for Muslims to treat it like it's sort of legal binding and then try to then say it's legally binding for Christians shows they've not really done a lot of research on this stuff. But moreover, there are Talmudic passages like Kiddushin, for example, that forbid marrying minors. You read Michael Satlow's book that I cited in the debate. Michael Satlow goes through a lot of this stuff and points out that there's a lot of Talmudic passages that refer to, you can only really marry until after the girl has matured, and she also has to be a willing participant in this thing. So, they're just misrepresenting the Talmud. They're misrepresenting Christian sources. And this is kind of ironic because in his first debate with David Wood, Daniel criticized David for bringing up Augustine and not going to the sources, not referring to what Jesus said on certain things. And yet in this debate, he's not. So here, I wrote the quote down for people want to know. I think it was in his first debate with David Wood, at about 42 minutes in. He said, you have to go back to the original sources because that's how you criticize Islam. You look at the Prophet, peace be upon him, when you're justifying just war, Syria, and so forth, place it in Jesus' actual teachings. So this is what Daniel says in his debate, David Wood, the first debate, about 42 minutes in. Okay, but in my debate, no, I want to go talk about Christian apocryphal works in the Talmud. I don't want to go to the actual teaching. So, it's hypocrisy. This is what Daniel does. He'll use one debate tactic in one debate, and the next debate, he'll criticize that debate tactic.
Right. I mean, I like the part in the Q&A where someone in the audience brought up he basically just read that chapter of Genesis when Rebecca is going down and bringing the water to the camels. And I saw some commentaries. I think Gordon Wenham mentioned that this would be like, I'm probably getting confused. It's either Gordon Wenham or someone else. It might have been Kenneth Matthews, who said that this would require like something around like 80 trips to the well, like getting 80 like draws from the well, something like that. It's like, what 3-year-old? Like, do you know a 3-year-old? When the guy asked him that, I was just like, like who could do this? This would be some kind of like superheroine sort of character that's like far beyond her years. If she's 3 years old, and she could pull off these physical feats like that.
Yeah, no scholar thinks Rebecca was actually 3 in that chapter. The author is not portraying her as a 3-year-old. This has come again much later Talmudic texts that scholars say are just unreliable on this thing, and yet Muslims constantly bring this up as if it's somehow binding on Christian. Again, it shows you how little they understand the biblical texts, the Christian understanding of the Talmud, the Jewish understanding of the Talmud even. I mean, what they bring this stuff up like it's supposed to be like gotcha moments, and really it just makes them look, bad researchers.
Right. And I think one difference might be also that the different view Islam has of the prophets rather than Christians or even Jews for that matter, because he was saying that Isaac stands as an example for people to marry 3-year-olds, and then same thing with Muhammad marrying a 6-year-old and consummating with a 9-year-old, being Aisha, obviously. So that, like, where you can't criticize a prophet or something to that effect, that each time a prophet or a significant figure in the Bible must be interpreted or seen as some kind of moral example for all time and in all respects, it seemed like, if I have that right.
Yeah, well, their idea is that, the prophets are supposedly like protected by God to be like perfect moral examples. And this is what they constantly do. They constantly read the Bible through their Islamic lenses. And then they assume we Christians do. They do this all the time. And so they're like, how could you criticize Abraham? I'm like, well, easy. He was a sinner. Romans 3:23. I mean, you can't force your Islamic understanding in mine. So this is, again, why their arguments are just so bad. They constantly presuppose the Islamic worldview, like when it comes to prophets, and then they just assume everyone else has to have that view, which we don't. So it's a pathetic and it's just a bad argument, and it's constantly brought up by them. I'll criticize the prophets when they do something immoral, like Moses in Numbers 31. That was immoral. Noah becoming drunk. That was immoral. And that was wrong. We don't have to go through all the prophets and defend their actions. The only actions we need to defend are the actions of Jesus, and he was a perfect human being. So, right. I mean, like, you compare Muhammad to Jesus, there's just no comparison. Jesus is clearly morally superior in so many ways. Muhammad is not.
Yeah, the moral example of Jesus and the ethics of Christianity is one thing that brought me back to the Christian faith, just personally. But I thought it was interesting regarding this rabbinic tradition, or as he described it, a rabbinic tradition of Rebecca being 3, because I was looking that up. I was trying to find out where that came from, and I saw in another interview that you had that you mentioned that this did indeed come from the Seder Olam Rabbah, or Seder Olam, which dates, and so forth, if I'm correct, dates to the 2nd century AD. And there's a variance in the manuscript traditions where some say that she was 14 and then others say that she was 3. But this tradition that she was 3 carries on to the Tractate Sophirim in the mid 8th century, and then also even to Rashi. I know he was brought up during the debate. Even to Rashi says that she was 3 years old. And if I recall correctly, I was just looking over the quote last night. And Rashi's in the second half of the 11th century, for those who don't know, but and a very well-respected Jewish commentator and exegete. But earliest, go ahead.
He was respected, but Rashi got a lot of things wrong, like the age of Rebecca. He got, how people think that the ancient Mesopotamian god Dagon was a fish deity?
Yeah.
Okay, that's false. He was a grain deity. The reason why we think a lot of people today think he was a fish deity is because of Rashi. Rashi associated Dagon with the Hebrew word for fish, dag, D-A-G, how we would transliterate it. And so he said it must be a fish deity. And that still resonates with people today, even though it's wrong. So Rashi was not perfect.
Well, yeah, of course. And as Christians, we don't have to believe that either. But it was interesting because he said in his commentary that he married Rebecca when she was fit for marriage. And then says she was 3 years old, which is just like such a, like, what? How could you possibly think that? But there are a series of exegetical steps. It seems like there are a series of exegetical steps that one has to take in order to get this idea that she was 3. It has to do with, like, interpreting the timeline and different pericopes of Genesis. But the earliest tradition that I found, or earliest commentary or reinterpretation outside of Genesis on the age of Rebecca, or the first one that states her age at her marriage, was the Book of Jubilees. 2nd century BC, if I have that right, and this says that she was 20. So the earliest tradition, which comes hundreds of years after the composition of Genesis, has her at 20 instead of 3. So it really does show you just how poor the research that they're doing in their objections are.
Yeah, it's been a while since I read Jubilees. I'm going to go back and check that for sure, though, because again, this is what you get from a lot of people like Daniel. You just cherry pick the stuff you need and you ignore the rest. This is what he does with Bruce Rind. He just cherry picks Bruce Rind, but he'll ignore all the other meta-analyses that show how harmful child sexual abuse is.
Now, the other one I wanted to talk about briefly, because, like you mentioned, I did a video on the age of Mary and really investigating that claim. And ton of them use this. What was it? Sheikh Ibn Farouk uses this. Paul Williams, if I have his name right, I can't recall, uses this. All sorts of Dawah guys use this, and they'll say that Joseph was 90 and Mary was 12. But when you look at the early infancy narratives of Mary and the apocryphal traditions, the book the book that the age of 90 comes from is the History of Joseph the Carpenter, which dates as early as the 4th century. But that is derived from the Proto-Evangelium of James, which scholars generally date to the second half of the 2nd century, right? But it was interesting because in my research, I found that you could actually make a stronger version of their claim. Because scholar George Zervos, in his critical edition of the Proto-Evangelium of James, in a couple footnotes, he comments that, and here, I'll quote it for you right here. This is volume 1, page 166, footnote 141. He says that, and he's applying redaction criticism to the text, and says that first, I just want to say that he dates the Marian infancy narrative of the text to as early as a document written in the 1st century, which is relatively early considering, all things being equal. But here's the quote. He says that the redactor caused an irreconcilable contradiction in the chronology of the text by interpolating Proto-Evangelium's James, by interpolating PJ 1211, which states her age as 16 years when these mysteries had happened to her, which is when she was told by the angel Gabriel that she would conceive by God. His purpose was most likely to address the sensitivities of the Romans with respect to a 12-year-old girl being impregnated by the Jewish God. And now I know in a lot of your presentation, you talked about not only the psychological trauma and harms of, a young girl being pregnant, but also the physical harms. I was curious, could you let's assume all these things are true, right? Because this is just one scholar, he's an anomaly in this respect. This isn't respective of the dominant view. I contacted other scholars about this. They said that there's little to really go off of to say that this was actually an interpolation of the text. But still, let's just say for the sake of argument that it is accurate, that this was written in the 1st century, and that there may have been a change in the text or an addition to the text to address a 12-year-old girl being pregnant by God. So what would you say to that?
Well, I doubt that she was 12. It's just unlikely. I cited numerous experts on this, like Michael Satlow, for example, Brent Shaw, Keith Hopkins, that just girls in this period were not being married off at 12. That was exceptionally rare. You'd see that in more like elite marriages. And if you read texts from the Middle Ages, a lot of times when these upper class were doing that, they were still delaying consummation by a couple of years. So it wasn't this idea that 12-year-olds were being married off left and right in the ancient world and being forced to marry. There's another one. Amram Troper wrote a paper called Children in Childhood in Light of the Demographics of the Jewish Family in Late Antiquity. And it says on page 330, 331, scholars suggest that the average age of first marriage in Palestine in Western Dephoria was in the late teens or early 20s for women and around 30 for men. She cites numerous sources to back this up. Same conclusion Michael Satlow comes to. So I just don't think there's strong evidence to indicate that in the 1st century BC, Mary was 12. I think this is a much later tradition. So again, it's inconsistent with the actual historical and archaeological data to suggest that. Now, if this is true, remember that she actually was that young. Remember, traditions also say she was a perpetual virgin. So there was never any sexual abuse or intercourse or anything like that. So she was basically off. God basically took her out of the whole dating pool thing and said, no one can ever sexually touch this girl. She's special. Okay. So if we're going to go off the Catholic traditions, we need to take that one as well, I guess. And third, we have to remember that this is not a good comparison with Muhammad's obvious abuse of Aisha, because God is omniscient. He knows he can pick the right girl who's going to be fully mature and can bear the child with no problems because he has that type of knowledge. And he never once says that, anyone else should be sleeping around with 12-year-olds or trying to have children with 12-year-olds. This was a special circumstance. So you just try to, go through the Muslim argument to try to use Mary, and it just breaks down on every level. There's no reason to think Mary was actually that young. If she was a perpetual virgin. And again, God is omniscient. He can pick the perfect girl who would have been perfectly fine without any pregnancy complications. And also she consented. So there was no sexual abuse, let alone any sexual intercourse. This is just not a Christian teaching.
That's right. Yeah, I forgot about that. That's a really important part where she does consent to it. The angel comes to her and then she says, yeah, she basically says yes, right? I know that Catholics like to. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. The angel comes and says, the Holy Spirit will come upon you. And she says, let it be done to me according to your will. So even if she didn't, the angel doesn't ask her for permission, but she's like, yeah, this is a great idea. I'm totally for this. Let's go along with it. She never objects, resists, pushes back. She just says, yep, this sounds like a great idea,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and from generation to generation, each one will call her blessed. So it's really interesting because I wonder if any of them have actually read these apocryphal traditions that they reference, because I mean, like you mentioned, one of the key themes in the text, at least in the Protevangelium of James, is they're concerned with defending the perpetual virginity of Mary. And they also describe the text describe their arrangement not as a marriage. I mean, you can go back as far as St. Maximus the Confessor in the 7th century, saying that this is not a marriage proper. And then contemporary commentators will say the same thing. If I recall correctly, Bart Ehrman and Zlatko Plessy say the same thing. It's like they say that he was a guardian. He was given to her as a guardian. When they realize that she is pregnant, the priest realizes that Mary is pregnant. There was a huge scandal because they're like, Joseph, why did you violate the virgin? Why did you do this? So, and then also at the very beginning, when they're initially betrothed, Joseph objects because he says, I'm an old man and she is a young girl. Am I to do this lest I become a laughingstock to the sons of Israel? So even within that text, they recognize the absurdity of an old man marrying a young girl. So you could even use that against the early conscience of the Christians, either in the 2nd century or the 1st century, probably the 2nd century, against something like the arrangement of Muhammad and Aisha.
Oh, well, Christians were always against sexually using minors and abusing minors. John W. Martins wrote a paper, part of a book called Children in Late Ancient Christianity, and the title of his chapter is Do Not Sexually Abuse Children, the Language of Early Christian Sexual Ethics, where he points out that children were just not to be used sexually at all. And then we see this confirmed in the research by Brent Shaw and Keith Hopkins, that girls were not expected to be married or bear children until their late teens, early 20s period. Then, of course, Kim Phillips in her book Medieval Maidens confirmed this was the general standard even in that period. So children except for outliers, the majority of the church has been against this idea that children are not for sex. So 12 years old was exceptionally rare, and 9 years old was just off limits. It just was not discussed by Christians about, you don't use children for sex. Were sometime royals married at very young ages? Yes, but read Kim Phillips' book. They weren't sexually using them. A lot of these kings would put stipulations in, you can't consummate the marriage till this age, and it was typically late teens.
Well, that's really useful to know. I mean, that actually transitions perfectly to what I wanted to ask you, because a lot of his appeal is to what seems like Muslims that are either disenfranchised or that recognize that there is a massive problem with the present state of society. They're reacting to modernism and postmodernism. And his solution is we go back to a pre-modern worldview, it seems to me at least. And I've seen this even among some Christians, going back to pre-modernism. Other people say, let's go meta-modern, so on and so forth. But I was curious because his representation of pre-modern people, including pre-modern Christians in his phraseology, is that child marriage was maybe not the standard in all cultures and in all cultures and all religions, but it was accepted in all cultures and all religions. I'm curious if you could comment a little bit more on that and kind of clear the air. Is that indeed the case that all cultures, all religions for pre-modern times accepted child marriage as ethically permissible?
A lot of pre-modern cultures accepted that child marriage was permissible. Now, what does that mean? In Europe, the minimum age is 12 in canon law. So this is not the idea that 9 and 6-year-olds should be married off and they should be consummating marriage. The minimum is 12. And again, Kim Phillips in Medieval Maidens, here is what she says. She says, late medieval English evidence of ages at marriage and motherhood indicates that canon legal theory on women's marriageable age offers a very limited perspective, and that social beliefs and practices provide a more reliable view of girls' transition to adulthood. She then says it would be a mistake to see marriage below or around the age of puberty as the norm, even for young noble women. So you got to take things into consideration. Like today, we say the minimum age for marriage is 18. Does that mean girls are being married off at 18 left and right? No, that's exceptionally rare in today's day and age. Typically, girls are marrying late 20s now. Same kind of concept in the Middle Ages and in many other cultures is that, I said in another work in the debate that the mean age in Egypt in the Roman period was 17.5 for girls. So again, late teens. No, this idea that, a lot of cultures had this idea of child marriage as a sense for like creating like tribal bonds or so that elites could marry their daughters off and make bonds that way. But they recognized as cultures it was not good to expect children to have sex. Well, let's leave the Romans out of it because they were kind of, as I said, Martin's in his paper points out, they were sexually abusing children and Christians were calling them to stop. But a lot of these cultures didn't want them to bear children because they recognized problems resulted. If these girls were bearing children at 11, 12, if at all possible in that day and age, it would result in numerous problems. Like Cyrannus of Ephesus in the 2nd century AD was saying, like, it results in all sorts of complications. That the pelvic floor has not been fully developed. The orifice is too small. You can't expect these girls to have children. This is harmful. And so, you got to take things with a grain of salt when you hear that like the marriageable age was 12 in like the medieval period. That was like the minimal, and most people were rarely doing that. And if you read Philip's book, she points out that even when girls were married that young, stipulations would come in that consummation had to happen years later.
Right, that makes sense. Okay, so it was there in pre-modern societies. Obviously, we're talking about a lot of the world, but
and I acknowledged that in my opening statement. I said, it was there. That doesn't mean it was good or moral or useful. It was obviously harmful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then even on top of that, even if it was the standard, right, standardly accepted, that's ethically permissible, that'd be different from a Christian worldview, which is, okay, well, like you said, pointed out, no, actually, you shouldn't be doing that. So I guess the more salient point for our purposes, or particularly for your purposes, would be then to defend the Christian conscience. Am I right?
Well, yeah, that's what we need to defend. And the Christian conscience was always against sexually using children, as Martins points out in his paper, Do Not Sexually Abuse Children. It's this idea that somehow Christians were A-okay. See, this is the problem with what you see with Daniel. He constantly thinks Christianity is Diet Islam until modern liberals came and ruined it all. And that's just nonsense. Liberalism was an offshoot of Christianity, modern secular liberalism. You read Charles Phillips' book, A Secular Age, points out it was like a corruption of Christianity in a lot of ways. They took ideas they liked in Christianity, divorced it from its Christian roots, and then tried to build a secular society with that. Now, you and I would disagree with that. But then they say that what Daniel does is he says, like, liberalism is its own thing and it's destroying traditional religions. No, liberalism in the right context, if it was still connected to its Christian roots, it would be perfectly good thing. And I would support it. I do still support liberal principles, not all of it, but liberal principles that came from Christianity. And they are an important, vital institution in a Christian society, as long as they're in the right context. So you cannot think that all pre-modern Christians were like all in favor of what Daniel taught. That's just not true. And even if they weren't, or even if they were, a lot of them likely would change their views based on the available science. Early Christians follow the science. Like Augustine, for example, was teaching this idea about natural philosophy early on. Then we see much later thinkers, Michael Roberts and Ryer Huikas, are historians of science. They know this was a Christian idea that was happening quite often in the past 500 years or so. So, if you were to go back in time and go, look, we have all this scientific evidence that child marriage is harmful, it seems very likely, given the data we have, they very much agree. Just like in pre-modern times, they use leeches to try to cure disease they shouldn't be, using them for. They were trying to cure, and they were using the best available data that was around at the time. That seems to be the same thing with child marriage. And still, we see a lot of evidence from the ancient world that, again, marriageable age, late teens, early 20s. It wasn't happening like rampant, like Daniel likes to pretend it was, like 12, 11 or something. I mean, it just wasn't the case.
Right. Could you comment briefly on the issues of canon law? Because he did bring up that canon law permits marriage as early as ages of 12.
Yeah. Yeah, as I cited Kim Phillips' book on this, that it doesn't really show what was actually happening in the medieval period. Canon legal theory just gives like a minimal age. But even when you see the actual documented marriages, girls were still marrying later typically. Or if they were marrying young, there were stipulations in there. They could not consummate the marriage until like 16 or 18. So that you had these protections in there as well. So she just says like this is like a minimal marriageable age. It doesn't refer to consummation or that the idea that girls became women at this point or they could be expected to manage a household. I mean, you got to take things into consideration here.
Right, that makes sense, especially given in the debate he did mention that because a child is married doesn't mean that the husband is if a girl is married early, it doesn't mean that the husband is permitted to consummate the relationship at marriage, right?
And he accepts that, but for some reason we need to say that 12-year-olds are okay to have sex, even though you could have a society that has a minimum age of 12, like in the Middle Ages, and they still thought consummation should happen after puberty. And he also tries to bring up the fact that Jesus never condemned child marriage. Well, this is an argument from silence at best. It's a stupid argument. Very likely Jesus didn't see a lot of child marriage because, again, in Palestine in this time period, girls were marrying on average in their late teens, early 20s. They weren't marrying at 11, 12. Okay? Jesus never condemned abortion. He never condemned animal torture. He never condemned homosexuality. He never condemned the worship of Osiris. Okay, he's not giving you an exhaustive list of everything that's wrong. He's laying down virtue ethical principles for guidance. And it's clear from the principles laid down in the New Testament, child marriage is wrong. I mean, there's no way around it.
Right, yeah, it seemed like his demand was that there would be some kind of there has to be an explicit statement of condemnation of every little thing that's wrong in a Christian ethical framework in order for it to actually be wrong in a Christian framework. It's just like I don't know, it kind of just shows you that he doesn't really know that much about Christian theology, yet he criticizes it relentlessly.
Well, he doesn't. He doesn't know a lot, and he's constantly viewing the Bible through the Islamic lenses, because that's what they do in Islam. They have all these hadiths, this long legal tradition, commentaries. They give guidance on this stuff, and that's just not the same with Christianity. So again, they're constantly assuming that Christianity is diet Islam. They're reading the Bible through Islamic lenses and expecting Christians to do the same thing. And so their arguments don't even get off the ground. That's how bad they are, because most Christians are going to see this stuff and go, this isn't Christianity. What are you talking about? Jesus doesn't have to condemn every single immoral thing out there. And again, he has not demonstrated that child marriage was a rampant problem in Palestine when Jesus was walking around. Imram Troper and Michael Satlow point out that, this it wasn't. That girls were marrying after they completed puberty for the most part.
Which again shows the dissimilarity between this case and then Muhammad's case with Aisha, because the hadith, the Sahih hadith, describe her as being prepubescent. So, I mean, it's interesting because if we were to make an argument in the context of a Christian Islam debate, and we were citing weak hadiths to support our criticisms of Islam, we'd be torched, right? And rightfully so. But they but they cite these unreliable apocryphal traditions and rabbinic traditions in order to ground their criticism. So, I mean, I don't know. At some point, it just seems, nauseating, or just you get sick of just pointing out all the different hypocrisies, because you're just like, all right, well, there's another one, there's another one, there's another one, there's another one. At what point, when do we even stop?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And at the end of the day, all of the research indicates child marriage is harmful. So you can't get around that. There's no reason to force young girls into these situations because of all the harm it causes. And so he's trying to compare it with transgender surgeries. Well, he's making a philosophical error here as well, because there is a difference between forcing a young girl into a harmful situation like child marriage and not letting a child get a procedure they think is beneficial for them. It's like this. If some woman came up to me and says, I need to get breast implants to be happy and not be depressed. Okay. I don't need to help her, because I could say there are other ways to be happy and not be depressed. Why don't you explore those? the kid says they need to transition, we don't have to support that because we can say there are other ways to deal with these mental issues, this depression or this lack of happiness you have. You don't need this. So child marriage is a different action than this, because instead of just not letting something happen, you're forcing girls into these harmful situations. And that is that is directly evil. It doesn't compare, because one is an active action, the other is a passive action. You're just actively not participating in their transitioning. So he doesn't understand the basic philosophy here, and so these don't compare for that reason as well, other than the other reasons I listed earlier. So yeah, I mean, we shouldn't be forcing children into child marriages because of all the harm it causes. It doesn't compare to just not agreeing that children should get transitioning surgeries. Okay, there's a difference between a passive and an active action here.
Right. I mean, and that whole topic is another massive can of worms as well. I'm glad you commented on that, because I was hoping you would at some point. I felt like it should have been addressed a little bit more in the debate, even though I thought you sufficiently addressed it during it.
Here's the thing, I don't have time because Daniel was so flustered. He just kept interrupting me. I had to remind him he kept interrupting me. So I'm trying to think, what can I say quickly just to move on from this really bad argument he's making? And I'll just point out, as I cited, the article, gender dysphoria is rising and so is professional disagreement. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll just point out that he's wrong. This is not the consensus like it is with child marriages. So he's comparing apples to oranges.
Right. Well, do you feel like you accomplished what you're hoping to set out in this debate and the aftermath? And do you expect to have another one up this alley?
I hope not. I mean, I hope this was the final word. I was very happy with the ending. The only people that say I did bad are Daniel's hardcore fans. I've had positive feedback from Muslims, from atheists, Christians, Hindus, you name it. Everyone is saying that, yeah, I clearly did a far better job than Daniel looked weak. He looked unprepared. He looked flustered. He was unable to answer a lot of the research I brought up. Like at one point in the open discussion, he's like, you need to show child marriage is harmful. And I just had to point to the screen and go, did you pay attention? Yeah. Like I gave you all the data. So yeah, I mean, his hardcore fans will always say he's right and won regardless of the clearly what actually took place. And they don't really bother me. I just find it kind of amusing. But yeah, I've got a ton of good positive feedback from this. Clips have already been taken and been used to expose how horrible and evil this is. This is like I said, I set out to do this, and I feel like I accomplished it quite well. And Daniel is still trying to do damage control on Twitter. We'll probably see some damage control later when he does his post-debate review. So, I mean, yeah, it didn't go well for him. Let's just say that. And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, David Wood had put it in a great way. He said,
how many people are there in the world? 7-8 billion now? Like out of all the people in the world, that is the last person you should have challenged. And that's the first person he wants to go to for this debate.
I was like, yeah, that's put pretty well. It shows definitely, a difficult debate opponent. Absolutely. I mean, credit to him for doing that. It's definitely courageous in some respect, or just flatly delusional. I can't tell which one. If not some combination. Yeah, right.
I mean, you don't challenge a father of a daughter on child marriage. And I love to research. So,
right.
And again, the day he challenged me, I was like, let me just start looking up some studies and see what the actual research says. And for a few hours, I knew that he was just blatantly wrong and he would get destroyed. And sure enough, yeah, the research, and all he can appeal is this massive conspiracy. Oh, the West is out to make sure we can't rape children. How dare them?
Right. Yeah, and then not to get into the moon landing stuff either, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I found that gem when I was researching him. I mean, I found a lot of other gems. Found an article back from 2017 that's pretty damning as well. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that he should never have let me find.
Right. I'm especially glad that you mentioned that Muslims have reached out to you and applauded you on either your performance or just you arguing against that stance. Is that right? They were being against child marriage as well, or they were just saying that you won the debate?
Oh, they're saying I won. Now, so I mean, I think I obviously did far better than Daniel. So it is happy. I'm happy to see that Muslims are saying, we don't support this guy. He doesn't represent us. And I think that's great to hear.
Yeah.
I hope they push him to the fringes like Christians have pushed Steve Anderson to the fringes and said, this guy doesn't represent us, because they need to do the same with Daniel. He should not, but he's got a huge audience on YouTube, which is scary. That's
it's like 300,000 subscribers, is it not? something like that.
Something like that. Yeah, and that's scary. The fact that he is deceiving and manipulating so many young Muslim men. And so that's another reason I challenged him. He's got such a big audience, and now the debate is on his channel, and I don't think he's going to take it down. And I'm happy about that. I'm so happy. All of my research is up there for his audience to see, and for them to either accept that he made a big error in supporting child marriage, or they're just going to have to make pretty bad excuses to get around it. So either way, it's not going to look good for them.
Yeah, it seems it's an interesting strategy. I guess you kind of have to, in some respect, if you're going to double down and be like, I won this debate. See, I'm so confident that I won this debate. I'm going to upload it on my own YouTube channel and here, my audience, watch this. I performed so well and, defended such an abominable thing. I really hope this is this is put to bed at this. I mean, I don't expect it to be, because some of the things that are growing in our culture, but hopefully this is put to bed completely as far as the sexualization of children goes, at least with respect to the context of child marriage. But anyway, do you have any upcoming debates or videos that you have scheduled that you want to tell people about?
No, I don't have any upcoming debates planned right now. I'm probably going to take a little bit of a break and focus on getting some videos done. I want to do some more videos on the reliability of the New Testament. So I'm doing a video on why the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies. I'm going to do a video on arguing that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are actually the authors of the four Gospels, and do some more stuff around that kind of basic idea. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on in the next couple of weeks. I'm redoing an older video from 2018 on atheist intelligence. So yeah, I got some good stuff coming up.
Very, very briefly, have you ever investigated into the claims regarding, or into the research regarding the association or correlation between atheism and autism?
Yes, I have. I have looked at it. Now, there is some research that shows that if you're more on the autistic spectrum, you tend to be an atheist. And so that may account for why atheists appear to have more analytical intelligence. Because, people that are autistic tend to do really well on IQ scores, or tend to be on the spectrum, I guess would be a better way to say it. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, religious individuals tend to have more emotional intelligence, which is a different form of intelligence. So yeah, there is some interesting research. I'm not going to bring that up in the video, because there's some other factors as well that need to be considered that I think are more important than that right now.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining and having this conversation. It was a very, very wild debate. I've never seen you so animated in any of your debates before, and understandably why you were. But
don't go after children. Now you've unleashed something. I will defend children always, especially from predators and their apologists like Daniel.
Amen. Amen. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Michael. His channel is Inspiringphilosophy. Check him out. He puts up a very high standard for YouTube content, so I encourage everyone who sees this video to check him out. Thanks for joining me, Mike.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
But again, Bruce Rind says this was eroded when Christians came in and basically ended it. So I'm sorry that we in the West came in and we took away your child brides and your gay erotic poetry with our Western values. My bad.